And now. But there it is. See, I can't record without your knowledge. All right, everybody. We're here with another night with the Critiquery. We are reading a couple of pieces by Edean. The first is the beginning of a novel, and the second is a short story. Edean, do you have a preference? Which one we start with?
Let's start with the novel.
Starting with the novel. All right, so we're gonna start with the novel, do what we always do, which is go around each person, take about a minute, something that you enjoyed and something that you'd like to talk more about. I'm gonna go based on how you look on my screen. Anna, you're first.
All right. So first of all, I enjoy reading it again. I noticed a lot of edits that we suggested, so that's awesome. I really like your character descriptions. You really get the feel for the character personality. Something to work on is sometimes you have some run-on sentences that could be chopped up quite a bit.
All right, thank you, Anna. And then we have Matt.
I really enjoy the story in that it's like a kind of like a historical fiction, and I kind of liked the content of it, like what you were writing about when it was set. The thing that, well, there's questions that we're going to get to, and one of the big things is part of those questions about the intro. So.
All right, thank you, Matt. Devora, you are next on my screen.
For the novel piece, I really liked the characters. I thought both women were intriguing. Their dialogue was cohesive and it didn't feel excessive in any parts. It didn't feel contrived. They were just, I was really interested to hear what they were saying to each other and their motivations, unrolling the motivations. The only thing that I would suggest tweaking is to clarify the time and setting, so I'm fully immersed in the actual time that this is taking place, because there's trunks, there's stuff with her, what she's wearing that comes along later. And I think I would prefer to have that a little bit sooner, just so I can get really rooted in the setting.
All right, thank you, Devora. Ray, you're next.
Yeah, so as I think my third time reading this intro, which I still love it. And it's hard not to compare, though, to past versions. So I'll try not to. And one of the things I did notice about the beginning, while I do think the tension is probably increased from previous versions, there is, I did stumble a little bit at the beginning. I have some notes on that, but I appreciate overall what you changed in it.
All right, and then Ian.
I've also read a few versions, and it's hard to separate them in my mind for critique purposes. I like the vividness of this scene, and I really liked the hushed tone of the whole thing. I feel like it's a good, tense opening. And I think that this chapter is getting tighter and tighter and more focused as I see more visions, so that's good. In terms of something I want to come back to, tension is one of the questions that you asked about, so that's something that we'll talk about when we get to tension. And I also have some like mild concerns about characterization with regard to Yamina and Barcelona. But I think it's based on information that I have about the rest of the novel, so I don't know if it's valid to bring up tonight. We'll see if there's time.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And I will go last and say that I too have read this a number of times and enjoyed it every time. Definitely saw some changes that, like Anna had said, some people had mentioned here. It's always nice to see the critique at work. And yeah, lots to love the sentences. Something to talk more about would be just little spots where maybe the tension slows down a bit. As I'm sure is not surprising, I don't have any huge notes on this. It's very polished. And with that, we can get into the questions. Unless, Edean, did you hear anything in that opening that you wanted to get to first?
No, tension sounds like a good place to start.
Okay, I will start with question 2 then. I'm going to do it. Do you feel much tension? Is the question related to that? And almost everyone mentioned it, so I'll let people jump in, or I will call on somebody.
I go first. Okay, so the tension I felt was subtle but keen, and the physical threat is reflected by her shaking when she's counting the coins and then making scratches and listening all the while for the different house noises. I love old houses. Anytime there's an old house in anything, I'm just like, ooh, what do those noise means? It's almost like it's a distinctive character that's telling us things that are going to enlighten us to the tension. I thought the butter knife was a really good touch. It showed that she was scared, but it didn't feel like a cliche. I was almost expecting her to like run out without any thought about what was going to happen to her attendant afterward. It was just like, one track minded, I have to escape now while I can, but she didn't. And that added an interesting layer of tension to me too. She's mindful of the fact that this attendant could also be brutalized in some kind of way because she's helping her escape. And I thought that was cool.
Nobody tell her where that idea came from.
Butter knives.
I don't know where it came from. Where'd it come
I say that because the previous draft had exactly the thing you're talking about. She just leaves, and other people had mentioned the concern that you had, and that was a workaround that I came up with. But that's why there's smiling faces, because it's very much inspired by people's critique.
Nice. We're doing it, people. Ian, yes, I unmuted.
Oh yeah, just to offer a dissenting perspective with regard to that tension. I kind of felt like the tension went back and forth for me, because sometimes it is visceral and Remedios is shaking and she's nervous and she's like jumping at every sound. But at other times she's doing things that seem like strangely time inefficient for the kind of fly-by-night escape that she's trying to do. Stacking the coins outside of the safe before tallying them and putting them into the bag, for instance, just seems like an extra step that all it does is make it easier to get caught. And I kind of
The reason
felt
that
like,
happens is because when I tried counting coins myself, it was actually a lot slower if you did it any other way. But I don't know if I need to mention that detail.
well, I was just thinking about, like, since this is the night of her escape, it seems like backloading a lot of the time-consuming tasks of doing that. But if it's important to get the count right, and if she does have more time defined than it seemed to me like she did, then I guess that makes sense. And then going back with the butter knife, I similarly felt like we'd already established in the scene that like time was of the essence and they needed to be sneaky and quiet and sneak on out of there. And so while it is true that it shows some concern that Remedios has for Yamina's fate, I feel like it does undercut the tension a little bit, because it's another instance of her kind of doing something that time consumptive, big time chunks. But otherwise, I really like the intensity and the insistence of the pace for this scene. Like overall, it's still a pretty tight, pretty gripping, pretty filling opening.
I will piggyback on that for a moment and say that I thought there were lots of times where the tension was really high with that visceral description that Ian was referencing, where we really get into Remedios's mind and it becomes disjointed. And I thought there were moments where it slowed down a bit, like when she's writing down the amounts and we get a lot of detail about, is she doing it right? It's difficult, she doesn't know if it's correct. And it kind of made me ask the question of why she was counting it now, as opposed to when he was hopefully out of the house doing his lawyer business. If she had access to it, she could have counted it some other night. So I did have that question. But overall, in terms of tension, I really thought it did a really good job. And like Devora, I enjoyed the fact that Yamina was brought into it, and we really can see the stakes there. Yeah, so I thought the tension was very good, except for in a few spots. Any other thoughts on tension?
Definitely think the only times that I really felt the tension go down is some of the background information, like when she's going over how her husband is a big lawyer and stuff. And I understand like wanting to set him up as like this like defining person that is scary, but I feel like a time to reminisce about that would be later on, whereas when she is running out the door, she can notice the door as like something of like, I'm escaping and this was always his, not mine. But like more detail probably should be a little later, just to keep the tension in that scene.
All right. Any other thoughts on tension? People have spoken about it before. Ray, yes, I see it unmute.
Yeah, I'll just add my 2 cents on the tension. And one thing I noticed, I felt like Yamina was where the most tension was in this part of the story. I think there's some changes made where her sense of fear has been heightened from previous versions. And definitely just as opposed to where this tension's lacking, I just think the tension's greatest when you can see the concern with Yamina.
Matt, I feel compelled to call on you as you are the lone silent voice. Any thoughts on tension? And you don't have to have any, but in case you do.
Not a whole lot. I like the tension that develops on the second page, and I think I kind of get a little bit of what Ian's saying with like kind of like her inefficiency kind of takes away from that tension. And I think it's kind of like the first page where there isn't like the fear or like the overriding like why is she doing this that's quite there, or necessarily like the effect of the danger that she's there. I think it's just that first page, but then it gets pretty clear like by the second page, and then the tension there at that point is pretty palpable, because like the first page does feel like she's just kind of like not in danger, I guess.
Good to know. Okay. And before, because that is pretty much the second and third questions, before I move on, Edean, anything you heard there that you want to dive deeper into or move on to the opening?
No, that was perfect.
All right, we're speeding through here. We do have 2 pieces, so that's a good thing. So the first question, which everyone did seem also to have some thoughts on, was, are you drawn in with the opening few sentences / paragraphs? And again, we'll go quiet and let anyone jump in.
I'll jump in. And so for me, the math got me, I have to say, because I don't know if that was intentional or if I'm just weird, but I was counting the math, and there's this, I don't know if it was intentional, but it seems like the count goes from 72,400 pesetas, and then she adds 250 and she has 72,750 pesetas, which I think that's 350 difference. And so I don't know if the math was intentionally wrong or if that was just a mistake, but it stopped me. It got me stuck. So I just want you to be aware of that.
Math-based in writing, you don't see that a lot, but very, very helpful to know that. Is that Matt?
Yeah, so I probably have the strongest feelings about the intro, or like the strongest ideas about it. I just felt like the intro was just kind of weird to me in that like that first line, each type of stolen coin had its own recognizable shape and heft. Like I can dig into my pocket and that's kind of the same thing. It feels like you're telling me something really too obvious. Gold ones were thinner and heavier, silver ones had sharper crenulations. Like I think just the phrasing is like a little like it doesn't really quite do it for me. It doesn't suck me in for the beginning. I think I actually really kind of like most of that second line instead. After the first 100, Remedios could count them by feel. I think that gets more to like the action, and like some of the other descriptions here, I think definitely pull away from that kind of action. And it doesn't like quite draw me like, yeah, just the description of the coins like really pulls me out of it. Like it doesn't draw me in right there.
I definitely agree with Matt. And I also would like to add, like, since that's the first introduction to the character, it kind of seems like she's a miser, since we don't know why she needs to have exactly that. And with her like being, obsessive with money, is like that's your first impression of her. That from later on in the book and even later on in the chapter, that's not her at all. So I definitely would change it just a bit, especially to you as an introduction to your character.
Other thoughts? But I was about to say, Devorah, I knew you had thoughts. Yeah.
As somebody who's never read any of this, I didn't mind it. I kind of liked it because I simply didn't know what was going to happen or who she was or what was going on with it, other than the whole stolen coin bit. Did it catch me in the first? I like the first line. Yeah, you could play with it. My only note that I made was that I wanted one more type of coin because I love the power of 3 thing.
And I would jump in here and say that I too would maybe say that I got sucked in more after that point where she's kind of doing the counting. I think other people have mentioned that that felt a bit like where the tension picked up as well. Although we get told that she's stealing, her actions feel, of course she's not relaxed, but they feel like an activity that would not go with what she's experiencing. And I would also kind of agree with what Matt said about the opening line, in that it could lead to the first part of it, stolen coin, says something. The second part, recognizable shape and heft, only means something as you go deeper into the description of what she's doing, and we learn that she's counting and she's her eyes are closed, and this whole thing which that she's doing is so much ritualistic, which again I felt maybe undermined the tension of the scene. Other thoughts on the opening? Ian.
It's just so hard for me to divorce my thoughts about this opening from my experience of other openings to the same piece, having seen where it all goes. So to stick with the text as it's written, I would say that there's a tonal tension in this first page between clandestine, secret, I need to move quickly and be stealthy and get everything accurate and get out of here, and I need to like bide time and occupy my attention while I'm doing it. The fact that she's playing a little game with herself feels less like it's calming her nerves and more like she's just kind of idle, like it's a solitaire thing almost. And the fact that she's doing all of this counting in the moment of stealing instead of like, I don't know, I always think of heist scenes in movies where they talk about the bank vault that has like $25 million in it. It seems like she would know what the amount is or that it was a sufficient amount going into it. So I don't know, I feel like it picks up for me in the second page once stuff starts actually happening. And there's even a line in the first page where it says that, the writing down of the tallies wasn't important, paper documentation was superfluous. And I got the sense as a reader that like, if it's superfluous, if the narrator is telling me it's superfluous, then maybe it's an obstacle to getting into the scene. So it's, again, it's hard to speak about because there are other openings that I preferred. But I do think that there's a lot of tension to work with opening in this moment, and maybe just matching the tone of the activity with the emotional experience that Remedios is having may help to sell that, to nail it, bring it home.
Scanning. Any other thoughts on the opening? We can also go into don't, or Edean, if you have any questions about that also, but if not, I can get into people's preliminary notes that didn't hit on any of the questions. I shall do that. So one of those is Devora. You had mentioned clarifying the time and the setting a bit earlier, perhaps. Could you get a bit more into what you meant by that?
Okay, so we know it's in Barcelona. We know it's coins, right? But I don't get a clear visual of her and what she's wearing, because that is always my best indication on what the timeline is. If a female is still in dress, we know that she's in a tan frock, but this is only till later when she's about to go out the door and her hair's uncovered, and her friend is just like, hey, you need to cover your hair. And that gives me a different, a good setting of time. But right now, where do I want it? See, it's, I could go every way, because when I was reading this, it didn't matter that much that I had to have the absolute date. I knew it was in Barcelona. I knew that it was pre-something, it was pre-industrial era possibly, and that she had to get on a ship, and that she needed an extra amount of money in order to get where she was going. But maybe when she's kneeling at the first part of this, if you keep it like this in the front, if you know, she makes some kind of reference to her dress, just something it will cue me into the fact that it's, I don't know, 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s.
I could move on to other preliminaries, but just give people a moment. If anyone else had any thoughts on the setting, the time, if that felt established in a way that worked for people, or if people didn't really notice it, and no one, if you don't have thoughts, you don't have to. But if anyone does, I want to give you a chance. Very good. Ian, you had mentioned some mild concerns about characterization with regard to Yamina and Barcelona, and I know you had mentioned that this had to do with knowing what happens later, but to the extent maybe it would be fair to talk about it now. What do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll defer to the author. Edean, is it important to you that I don't spoil things? Because I wouldn't want things spoiled if it were my critique, but I'll struggle to structure my feedback without spoilers. However, I'll attempt it if it's important to you.
If it's okay with you, I'd like to talk to you after.
Okay, that works. Yeah. I think that's, yeah, I don't have a better way to describe my comments without talking about things that happen in the plot. So if you can move on to another person and another comment.
I will,
Or
and
me and a
it sounds like
different
you have
comment.
detention, by the way. Okay, so I can say a little few things in here, and also I will send Edean written notes. But there was some moments where it was a bit, it felt very literary, but I wasn't sure exactly what it was going for. One of those was the goodbye was final, a sentiment appropriate to funerals. And in that line, I kind of thought to myself, people say goodbye all the time. And so, you know, it felt literary, it felt like it fit with the tone, but I wasn't sure if it was saying as much as it could in that moment. And then another moment would be that her hands, like when she's stealing things and her hands are, you know, she's recognized the hands feel like they're shaking because they know that they were the ones who stole it. Well, it sounded good. Again, I wasn't quite sure what it meant because I wasn't sure, you know, are they the true agents of her theft? Isn't that a brain? But anyways, so I got into the weeds of the metaphor and I wasn't sure about it. Any other, I know we're almost at the halfway point, and Edean, and you always have so many good questions. Do you have any questions, or should I, Matt, you've unmuted.
Yeah,
Please.
I actually
Yes.
wanted to point out, because like the other thing that I saw here, and I'll talk about like the prose a little bit, the other part too, the short story, but the prose here I thought was a little like weird and unfocused in some areas. So Ian mentioned the notes that she's making on the bags when she's counting the money, like that just, it probably, like I didn't understand why it would make a difference if she marked it a little bit off instead of like the plus 250 if she had just like 2 SO, like none of that made any sense to me, like why that would be part of the prose. Jared also mentioned the thing about the goodbye being appropriate for a funeral. So that's for Remedios. And then the last word in that chapter is goodbye, but that's from another character who has a different sense of what that word means. So like, I don't quite understand, like it's very significant to Remedios, but not to Yamina. And that just kind of felt weird. And there are just like a few spots where I think the prose needs to be kind of like sharpened and honed a little bit better, because it doesn't take me out, but like it kind of like rattles me a little bit that it's a little unstable in some parts. And I marked that, and I'll send that to you in the email too.
Written notes are always appreciated. Anna, yeah.
Yeah, I gotta say, I actually really like the whole her partial goodbye to Remedios, just because like you know that she's a poet. I'm like, she can be literary because she is well read, and she's also seems young, and we know she's young because of the time frame that you put in. So being kind of I don't know, more in her head is probably a key character point.
This is what we like. Disagreement. It's the best. It's good. Critique would not work without it. So then any other thoughts on the prose, which I will say the only reason those few sentences stuck out to me is because the prose is excellent. But any other thoughts on it in general before we move on? Or Dean, any questions that come up from things people have said? Dean is silent.
Oh, no, no, I'm
okay. Okay, I was assuming you were still there. Okay, so it is 7:30, right at the halfway mark, and I will now move on to the short story titled "One for the Devil," and we can go around and again, no more than a minute, say something that we liked, something we want to talk more about, and because there's not too many of us, that should be doable in the time frame. So I will do it backwards this time and start with Ian.
And here I was thinking that I had all this time to crib everybody else's responses. You're too clever for me, Jared. Something that I liked, under a minute. I liked the vibe. I liked the college dudes on an aimless road trip, falling into and out of parties and kind of figuring out their feelings about each other a little bit. I think that that's a rich ground, and I like seeing male characters interacting affectionately with each other when there's not like a sexual tension necessarily at heart. Although I do have questions about that with these characters. Anyway, in terms of something I want to come back to, it's kind of hard to tell where the story's going and what the characters want and kind of what they're after. I think one of the characters even says that like they stopped existing a long time ago or something to that effect. I'm butchering the line, but it made it hard for me to be invested in the way that it unfolds. And I felt like the ending was confusing, but I think the preliminary notes said that it's not the ending. This isn't completed, so maybe that's not relevant.
All right, thank you, Ian. Ray, you are next.
All right. Yeah, I really wanted to like this story, mostly because it has a edginess to it and an unpredictability that really makes it enjoyable to read. However, there's a stylistic choice here to be intentionally vague, I feel like, and either be quick cutting or leave certain details out. And it makes the comprehension hard for me. I definitely had to read it over a few times and still, rather than being illuminating as I read it over, I get more frustrated because I feel like I'm missing something that maybe is obvious, but maybe I'm not missing anything because it's incomplete too. But I do appreciate what you're going for here. I just think that it's a little, it's a bit of a skeleton story, and I think it needs a little more flesh on its bones.
All right, thank you, Ray. Devora.
I loved the visceral quality of it, the floating timelines, the shifts in perspective that made me guess where he was and what he was thinking of, and if those memories were actually real, because he substantiated himself as sort of a non-entity. Loved that. The one thing that bothered me, I don't know if the title works. There's no mention of devil in it, unless I missed it, but I think that it could. I think I'm reading into a lot of it. And it's one of those stories that I was okay with questions at the end of it, where I was ruminating on what it could possibly mean.
Thank you, Devora. Matt.
So I had like kind of like the opposite thoughts for this story as opposed to like the chapter beginning that you gave us. I think like these kinds of stories with like douchebag, like, you know, college kids like doing douchebag things, I tend to hate them, but I thought the prose like written here was really fantastic at a lot of points. There's some really good like dialogue sentences that like really grab me and that like they sum up the characters really well. They describe like really kind of like incisive things, and I thought the writing like here was really, really great in like the prose sense. And I have like maybe a suggestion for what might help you with like where you want this story to go, because it does meander a little bit, but like again, you were trying to figure out like where it's going to go. So
All right, thank you, Matt. And Anna.
Yeah, so like other people have said, I enjoyed the dialogue and the tone. It was very like Catcher in the Rye-esque. And also similar to what other people said, I was a bit amiss when that chapter ended, or the story ended. I know it's not the official ending, but it was definitely one of those like like I really don't have any idea where this is going, and this seems extremely unsatisfying. I want to know more. So that's what some critique.
And I will go last and say that I really enjoyed the prose here. I'm a big fan of direct sentences, and there's a lot of them that are still very interesting and poetic and lyrical, which is very hard to do. So I really appreciated the prose. I also liked the, it felt, one of the questions about tension, and it kind of didn't feel like maybe it's supposed to have too much tension. Those some things are mentioned. So I think some of my questions are around the incompleteness of the story and where it's going to go. And maybe something I would like to talk more about as well is the narrator and their interesting combination of self-awareness and also seemingly missing connections, which is an interesting thing to have in a character. Okay, so that's all of us. Edean, anything in those opening remarks? Should we get into the questions?
So I didn't write questions for this one, so let's just go with the opening remarks.
Okay, because I just applied the question you asked for the first one to both.
Because you're a very clever man, and I did not distinguish the fact that those questions were only for the chapter part, but I didn't actually write questions for this. So
I was wondering about the tension question. I was like, tension does not feel super important right now for the story. Okay, so let's just go with what was mentioned in these opening remarks, and I will go first to the thing that was brought up, I think, the most, which is maybe a bit of meandering in the story, wondering where it's going. And so maybe people could elaborate on what they meant when they were referencing that.
And if they want to add, I just thought of a question. Where do you think it's going, or maybe what you think it's about, if that's anything you've given thought to?
So I think obviously this is going to be like Blues Brothers kind of thing, like just copy that verbatim. I think that would help finish this out. But really, so I tend to be very distrustful of like fraternities and sororities and those kinds of relationships, which feel really shallow to me, and seem really deep to the people. So like on page 10 of the submission, you've got, where is it? The second paragraph, the end of that. So I read that, and it definitely frightened me enough that I think it's kind of where the story's going. The narrator's talking. He's never once bought me a birthday gift. He doesn't even know the date. I don't know his either. And he would help me bury a body, and he wouldn't give me that much grief about it. So that to me feels like Chekhov's like gun just on display, and it feels like it's gonna go off like one way or another, probably around the end of the scene that he started writing. That kind of like, I'll just pitch it that I think it's a good thing to kind of lean on, because again, these people don't really know each other. They're just college kids. They're stupid, just inherently. And personally, like, I think they're kind of a little dumb as well. And just having that kind of like, I'll help you bury a body. I don't really need to know anything about you. That kind of thing is just an inherently very dangerous kind of relationship. And I think I want that to explode. And I want to see why that's dangerous. And I want to see what that does to these two characters.
All right, very specific thoughts, always very helpful. Other thoughts about Edean's question of where the story is going?
Yeah, I saw a couple of lines toward the beginning that I really wanted to pay off, but in a similar Chekhov's mantle kind of situation. Because the first line of the second paragraph is when the narrator talks about the time that he was planning his permanent exit. And then later we get some information about how he's going to miss his like consultation with his senior advisor or whatever due to a car accident. And that he's not going to fail the course as a result. And so that kind of suggests one of those, like, if your roommate dies, then you get an A for the semester situation. I think that the friend, the brother, is going to die in a traffic collision on their way back from the Nevada border for whatever reason. And that accident is going to result in him missing the consultation, but somehow also passing the grade. But it's not clear to me why he cares what happens to the brother, or why he cares what happens in school, or what causal event is going to precipitate that calamity, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of causality so far. So that's where it kind of looks like it's going. But again, it's hard to wrangle this bull. It's hard to like really get on there and know where it's headed instead of just like getting bucked.
Anna, I think I saw you unmute as well.
It did. So it's less of a idea of where it's going, but more of the fact that it's in a short story format and it's, you know, about like self-discovery and a lot of meandering kind of thoughts. It doesn't suggest that it would be a short story. It suggests that it would be a longer story to like actually encapsulate like somebody's, you know, potential growth as a person, from this person that could die at any moment and wouldn't care to like somebody who potentially would. But I think that's why I was a little disappointed at the ending, just because it just didn't seem like it would end up being a short story or like a magazine submission piece or something, just because there seems to be so much to the character that would be completely unresolved in like 15 pages.
Yeah, I was thinking about the narrator, who seems kind of nihilistic and at times, you know, and is reflecting on that. And it feels like maybe there's, you know, you'd think it would go towards some different perspective there. We have identities brought up a bit with their ethnic background and the friction that creates in different situations. So these things, there's themes that are definitely present. I'm not sure I know which one is the focus yet, and you know, what's the heart of the story. Is it about someone? Oh, I didn't know what it was about. It was about, wasn't even sure it was about these two friends necessarily. Is it about their relationship? Is it about the narrator only? I was left with a lot of questions, although I certainly enjoyed being confused, because it was beautiful to read. I really enjoyed reading it, even if I wasn't sure where it was going. But other thoughts on the direction? Oh, Matt, yeah.
I just wanted to add a little bit of the thing that Ian had mentioned, because like at the bottom of that paragraph, as far as the accident goes, this is just kind of a minor thing, but he just says, I will miss his meeting because of the accident, not necessarily a car accident. So I think it's just vague at this point what the accident is going to be. And it's obviously not in the story yet. When that gets in there, it'll probably be honed a little bit more specifically.
Yeah, Devorah, yeah.
This is circling back to the title, because I'm a junkie for titles, especially in short stories. When it hits you at the end, if you get it just like that in that sweet spot. And I know it's a working title, so who knows? Okay, so these are the questions I had after I read this. Does this mean the narrator is surrendering to temptation, or AKA the devil, but he never mentions the devil or faith or whatnot? So I really want to know what he believes in, if it's God, no God, many gods, pure abandonment. Because this work is mostly literary, I don't need the answers, but I really enjoy the narrator's voice. So staying with him longer isn't a hardship for me. I like him, he's funny, the things that he's going through feel relatable to, I think, a lot of people. I really get the sense, this was my whole takeaway from him, that he's someone who has confused being lost with being broken. So I really think that he's just lost. He's not, but he's like really convinced himself that he's this broken person. Or it could mean that, you know, somebody needs to buy the devil a drink. I mean, those were my notes about where the title might be going with this.
Anyone I haven't heard from yet on where the story is going? And did I hear from you? I think, yeah, I did, right? I did, yeah, okay. And then I will only add here that I was wondering about the rage. It seems like there's a lot of anger, and in terms of where the story is going, and it turns out it wasn't a question you asked, but tension. You know, I felt that I wanted to see in more situations. I don't know. I wanted to feel that when they were in that room with that guy who had his hand on Gabby, or that guy was dancing with, I wanted to feel like something might happen. And I think we're not given that chance, because we're kind of shown and told by the narrator that they're so calculating, they're so thinking ahead, that if they're not, it doesn't feel like they're in danger of doing anything stupid. So to me, that almost lowers the stakes. I know they could do something stupid, but it just seems like they're so aware of the situation that it kind of takes away tension of, oh, are they going to just explode and do something like totally outrageous? And maybe that doesn't need to be there, but anyways. Edean, any other questions? Because I can go back to the preliminary notes as well.
I have a couple, but I think the preliminary notes had some good stuff I was hoping to get to.
Beautiful. Then let's get to them. One of the notes that I wanted to get to was, Ray, you talked about the style maybe being intentionally vague, feeling a little frustrated with that. So maybe you could elaborate.
Yeah, I tend to be a simple man and a simple reader. And definitely, for me, I had a hard time grasping it. I mean, the main gist I got from the story was the main character was trying to piss everyone off, and that there's some questions about race, about sexuality, about their intentions on this trip. I didn't get the Chekhov's gun or the reference to the cinematic classic Dead Man on Campus. I just kind of saw this story that was trying to be a edgy story, and it's good. The prose is obviously good. You're really good at the prose. I think what would have helped me is a little bit more centering. We never talk about who this character is. We're just kind of thrown in and trusting his voice. It's not that we need a description of the character, but I wasn't really feeling like working that hard to try and figure out to find some meaning in it. And I think just maybe a little bit of grounding from the start and a little less pizzazz would help, simple reader like me try and get into it a little bit more.
All right, I know it was muted, but I just want to appreciate the very dry name drop of Dead Man on Campus. Nobody else, but I like that.
I also did, but I didn't want to interrupt. Matt, yeah, you just unmuted.
I was actually going to kind of comment on a bit of what Ray's saying, and I get what you're saying about kind of being unmoored in this story a little bit, but I think for me it works for this particular narrator. He says time and time again in multiple ways that he's been dreaming for days, he's an unmoored from reality kind of character, or unmoored from anything that's significant and meaningful. And I think that's really important in this particular story. And I know Jared mentioned that party scene, he started getting really angry and really frustrated. And I think the thing that's missing from that scene is, so this is just kind of like a floating balloon kind of character. He doesn't have any contact to what reality is. When he's getting angry in that scene, I want to see consequences for his anger and what he's starting to do to Gabby. And I think that's kind of what's missing with that particular explosion. I think that would be a good spot to kind of bring in those consequences and then get rolling on how those things are going to resolve, if that makes sense.
I want to get on this train. That characteristic of that unmoored from reality sense, I think I agree is a really compelling draw of the character, but I also worry that it's only kind of the first half of what should be a really compelling setup. And the other piece is that I really do want him to want something. I want him to want just anything, whether it's a firmer grasp on reality or to know his place in it, or even if it's just to be committed to the idea of banging Gabby. I'm not even entirely sure that that's a desire that he has, but I know that I would be a lot more invested in what he's going through and what he's trying to do if I had a clearer sense of kind of what he was after. Or I know that the brother mentions at some point that it's actually his vacation, and so the narrator shouldn't be encroaching on that. Knowing a little bit more about what the brother is trying to do, there are lots of road trips you take in college. There's the last senior spring break road trip, but there's also the first time leaving campus when you're a freshman road trip. Having some kind of grounding, even though the character is unmoored, would help carry me through the drama of the scene. It would at least help me know what obstacles to be on the lookout for, and also what the character values. And I don't really have a clear sense of those things right now.
Other thoughts on, well, oh, yeah, Deborah, go ahead.
Real quick, just to piggyback off Ian's, I agree with most of that, but I do think that we know what he wants. I mean, in the last paragraph, which is my favorite, he says, "I wish to be whole," and it does not happen, and it's heartbreaking to him. So like, I love the lead up to all of that. And it looks like he doesn't really care. But then at the end, you know, when something actually happens that he wants to happen, she's kissing him, she's got his attention, then it really hits him. It's just like, no matter what I do, I can't get this thing. I can't feel this wholeness in myself about who I am. I think that worked for me. I love that paragraph.
Yes, I like that last paragraph as well. The only thing is I would say is that I wanted maybe a bit more connective tissue around what being whole is, and and why he wants it, and going towards what Matt said about, the stakes of it. And, being whole can mean a million different things. And so maybe getting a little more specific with that could help. Is it because it also is hard because they're so self-aware. It's what I was talking about. It's this interesting juxtaposition of someone who's very self-aware and also doesn't seem to have a firm grasp on stuff like, what do they think about their, identity being brought into question? They seem to kind of throw it away and be a little nihilistic, but what does that come from? And that kind of lack of exploration into that part of things.
Hey, could you dig into what you just said? I'm curious. When you said they just throw it away, could you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, so he kind of says, that, I'm nothing. Like he comes up to me and I say, I'm mixed race, and that means, I think, but mixed is another word for nothing. Which again, very wonderfully written. But I just wasn't sure, and he said as much. And then he says in a later part, I don't have sex on Father's Day, how old I was when I lost my virginity. And these things they're brought up, but not as if they had any impact on who the character is now. Like, his father left. What is that? Does he think that has something to do with his anger? Like, and I not that this person has to be, but he's presented as so self-aware and so introspective that it seems odd in a very intriguing way that they kind of blow by this stuff as if it's kind of, just all part of being nihilistic and, this and that. I'm not sure if it's a note really, but it was just more interesting that this character seemed at one hand so able to think about their own thoughts, and the other hand, so distanced from where it's coming from, maybe. And maybe they just don't talk about it. We just don't get it here, but it's happening underneath the roof, underneath the hood of the car, but we just don't see it. So yeah, that's what I meant, if that makes any sense.
And I feel like that last paragraph really starts to shoot us off in that direction. Like it's a great powder keg that's going to blow us into a moment of self-discovery, because it is at least the character getting a superficial need satisfied and realizing that it's not exactly what he wants. And it raises all kinds of questions about like, well, if he's a very self-aware person and he's got all these blind spots, then is there like a major closet door shape sized blind spot that he's going to have to confront about his feelings for his brother? Or because it's not his biological brother, it's his like fraternity brother or whatever. And I wonder if that exploration is what goes south and contributes to the accident that's happening later. But that's why it's so tough to kind of teeter here. I feel like I'm in the first third of the story, and it's hard to know where I am currently without seeing the rest of it. And I guess that's feedback enough for a first third section of it, if that's the right estimate for the length that we're in so far.
I want to add a little bit to what Jared was saying about like his introspection and things like that. So this character I understand as like an intellectually intelligent person. He's able to view himself. He's able to see kind of who he is and like on an intellectual level, but I think he's lacking kind of like emotional awareness, I guess. And I think like he's able to kind of calculate who he is, but he doesn't quite understand where his like core emotions are. And I think for this story, that's a good place to start, but I think you need to find something that is just gonna puncture him right through, hit him to his core, shake him like emotionally, and then he'll start to like kind of discover who he really actually is, other than who he thinks he is.
I don't know. I think Ian might be right here. Might be what's happening. But other thoughts on the narrator? And again, Edean, I'm going to bring you in just because he said he has some questions, and I want to keep giving you chances. So, anything you want to mention?
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. The biggest thing is just this is so vague and maybe so unhelpful to ask, but it's the actual thing that I feel is kind of driving the narrative is the feel of it and where that feel the promise that the early part creates and where that maybe fails, or people had said that there were diversions or meandering, I think was the term I heard. And so if there's meandering that feels like, oh, this is a digression which could be shorter, or this is just irrelevant to what I feel like is the through line, that I'm very curious about. And since I didn't ask that and you weren't thinking when you read it, if nothing comes to mind, that's fine. But if there are some obvious things where you go, well, I don't understand why we're told X, that would be great to know.
I'm not sure, like, so as the story stands, because it's not a full initial draft, like I've read like On the Road and Big Sur, and I've been fine with that kind of meandering stuff. So I think you just have to like struggle with it, get through a full draft, and then you'll be able to see what you can cut away. I'd be very hesitant to cut away even like the little part on the beach at this point, because you don't quite know if that's going to be like supporting like what you want to do with your characters or not. So yeah, I wouldn't just cut it quite yet.
I was gonna say this whole story, and I would agree with Matt, and that's not very helpful maybe, but I think it's super atmospheric, and the part of it is that vagueness, the way that the story cuts from the present tense back to flashbacks without real transitions, which again creates that kind of dreamlike quality, which I think is, I mean, it seems intentional, and which I really admire and appreciate. So I'm not sure so much that scenes would get cut as much as maybe the scenes that are present would become more focused as the primary driver of the story clarifies itself to you, if that's something that's happening.
Then let me ask a different question. And that is, what do you feel is driving the narrative? Like, what is the singular or one or two aspects that are kind of like propelling this, if it's propelled at all? I'll make that assumption. Between like tone or atmosphere or vibe or actual narrative, which I don't think is possible because there isn't one yet, or character, or just any of that stuff, just whatever is like the thing that makes it attractive.
I love the idea. To me, this is all about youthful despair. I love the beach scene because he's so happy and he is complete at that moment, but he's oblivious to it. And then later on, it's like the same day where he's centered on that moment of like being naked and exposed and glorious and not even caring that people might be taking pictures of him. And then he's at a party being enraged about something. And that felt a little slippery to me, to have that transition going from I'm, in a place of wonder to I'm in a place of complete disregard for anybody else, for what they want or what they might need from me at this moment. But that does feel like youthful despair to me. There's this feeling that you're supposed to become something even while you're becoming it, but you don't know that it's the journey of growing into yourself during this time that feels sort of like, well, what am I doing? Like, what am I even doing with any of this? It doesn't make sense. So why should any of it matter? Which that feels like despair to me too. Does that answer anything? As vague as your question.
And then I was going to say that I felt that for me it was the atmosphere and vibe that pulled me along most. There were the mentions, the tidbits, the breadcrumbs of the pills and the accident that are more kind of normal plot stuff. But I would say for me it was more the vibe created by the prose and the voice that pulled me along.
The dude seemed really shell-shocked to me. Like we're getting the story in the aftermath of whatever happens that's caused his memory to get all jumbled and disjointed, so it comes in fragments and stuff. And where that works, I feel like it works really well. It's going to have to be a hell of an accident to sell it. And I'm doubling down through my rereading and reviewing of my notes. I think it is coming to terms with an intersectional identity thing. I think that our main character is both mixed race and has a sexual preference that he may not be aware of yet, and that coming to terms with both of those disparate identities may help with that whole feeling and may be part of what the journey of self-discovery through the story kind of is. But yeah, it's early in the story to tell.
All right, I'm going to jump in here and just say that for the sake of the recording, I'm going to end it. We can keep talking afterwards, but it is almost 8 and I just want to get a clean cut. And so I'm going to cut it right now. Thanks, everybody.